We bring in criminal defense and civil rights attorney Phillip Hamilton. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Hamilton. We heard from those first responders today and saw the disturbing videos of their attempts to save him. What were your takeaways from that testimony and also those images?
I mean, the takeaway just from the images is no different than it was yesterday. This is tough. It is very emotionally difficult to deal with, to see, no matter how many times over the course of the year we've all, even from an international standpoint, seen it. With respect to the testimony, it was an interesting juxtaposition in regards to the paramedics that testified today, in regards to the testimony that was provided by Ms. Hansen on both Tuesday and the earlier part of yesterday in regards to the trial. Because you saw from her, as essentially one of the bystanders in the crowd, someone who so desperately wanted to help Mr. Floyd, but was being held at bay from doing so, and in many respects has, as she testified, lived with a lot of the guilt and just despair ever since. In regards to the paramedics that testified today, you also saw a lot of concern and care in regards to their actions toward Mr. Floyd, which in many ways ran contrary to Officer Chauvin and his approach with regards to Mr. Floyd. And so when you see that due care that was ultimately given by the paramedics and the due care that ultimately Ms. Hansen wanted to give but was unable to, what you see is just a thread of everybody that approached and dealt with Mr. Floyd at that scene caring about him, aside from Officer Chauvin.
We also heard police testimony from a former supervisor of Chauvin's who stated that the policy at the time was to allow a knee to the neck, or a knee, just period, a knee to be able to restrain a subject. But it was only until that subject was handcuffed and under control. So just based on that alone, it sounds like Chauvin was clearly out of bounds based on the police policy there.
And the interesting thing is the way that the testimony came out from his supervisor is that it was clear that Chauvin, I believe, knew, number one, that he was out of bounds, because number one, he did not actually tell his supervisor anything about a knee until later on that evening when they had a conversation after it was known that Mr. Floyd died. It was like he tried to play that down with his supervisor, even though, as you're correctly stating, at the time it was policy that they could use the knee, Minneapolis being one of the few jurisdictions from a police standpoint that still had that policy in place from a national perspective. But nevertheless, could use it. He did, but clearly the argument is that he unreasonably used it and that it led to Mr. Floyd's death. And for him to, not tell his supervisor about that until after Mr. Floyd's death, I think it's a bit telling. And I think the state will play into that as the case moves forward.
And we also heard from George Floyd's girlfriend, Courtney Ross, who spoke about Floyd's struggles with opioid addiction. How does Floyd's drug use play into this case? And did her testimony potentially help the defense at all?
This was the one part of the testimony, this is the one part of the trial thus far that's probably the strongest point for the defense. Let's be frank. From the get-go, this is a tough uphill climb, if not an impossible one, for the defense, just in regards to the video and everything that we have seen depicted upon it, Officer Chauvin's actions and just everything that we already know in regards to what we've seen. However, what you can't see from the video is the toxicology of Mr. Floyd's blood and ultimately how, if at all, any drug use did in fact impact his death. And the one, I think, credible, strong defense that if they have any, kind of going forward in this trial that the defense has, is the issue of causation. Was it actually Officer Chauvin's knee to the back of his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds that caused, Mr. Floyd's death? Or was it the fact that there was some other underlying issue in regards to, Mr. Floyd's health conditions and his drug use that actually caused the death as opposed to asphyxiation? That's what the defense has been arguing from the get-go. And today was probably the first witness that they had that they were able to elicit some of that evidence onto the record as regards that defense, which frankly is their most credible one, I would say.
And the prosecutors laid out their case in their opening statement, and now we're hearing from a diverse group of bystanders and seeing videos from multiple angles and vantage points. How much would you say does the testimony and also these videos, how much do they back up the prosecution's case so far?
Very strongly. Very often, as criminal defense attorneys, look, I've tried cases that are bad uphill cases. But the one thing that generally you have going for you before you enter a trial is the fact that maybe the state's evidence or the government's evidence won't come out in the way that they anticipate that it will. And to the extent that it doesn't, that may undercut the strength of their case, and it may actually up your ability to be able to cut into their burden and, actually move forward with being able to receive an acquittal or, win the case in some respect. That's not the case in this case. The way that we have seen the testimony play out in many respects is exactly as Jerry Blackwell predicted that it would. It's almost in a sense his opening statement was simply a narration both of the video that we have also widely come to know and have seen, but also just the way that their case would flow. And to the extent that their case has flowed in that respect where it matches up with just the power of his opening statement, it really puts the defense in a bad corner in terms of trying to fight this case. Because if the case goes the way that Jerry Blackwell laid it out, the defense really doesn't have much of a chance, really, on any of the charges.
And lastly, George Floyd's death, of course, reignited the Black Lives Matter movement around the world with thousands taking to the streets. But we haven't really heard so much about race in this trial. Why do you think that is? It seems that it's very deliberate, perhaps. What role do you feel that race does play in this case?
I mean, it plays a very heavy case. And to the extent that we haven't heard about it post-opening statements, the fact is in jury selection, it played a very heavy role. And it was, communicated and discussed at length in regards to what were the jurors' positionings on race, in regards to Black Lives Matter, in regards to the protests last year, all of which had very strong racial undertones in regards to just systemic treatment of black men and black women in this country. So although we have not necessarily heard it played throughout the course of the trial post-opening statements, the fact is it can't be in any way not a part of the case, because it is. You see it on the video. All of these jurors, not just with respect to what happened last year, but they've all been alive and around over the course of the last 8-9 years that these systemic issues have played themselves out in regards to policing and Black America. So it's something, I think, from the prosecution standpoint, it doesn't make much sense in the course of the trial to highlight what is already known. That could simply be a distraction or red herring. I think it's most important for the prosecution in this regard just to focus on the facts, focus on the video. It speaks for itself. You see a black man under the knee of a white police officer. That doesn't need to be said, at least in the course of the trial. It's seen and the jury knows it. So it is playing a case in the sense of race, just maybe not as explicitly as some may have expected.
Phillip Hamilton, we thank you so much for your expertise and your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.